Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and zapping the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 422, Tesla Turret. Posted by Arundel and Yaroslav. Hello, it's time for those Tesla items I mentioned in Friday Facts 399. Tesla Turret. By Arundel. On Fulgora, you learn to control lightning, turning it from a threat into electricity. After learning to make more advanced electrical components and mastering the planet's electromagnetic science pack, you are ready for the next stages, converting electricity back into lightning and unlocking the Tesla turret. Okay, so this is a proper video with sound on this one, so we'll play it through and listen to it, but the caption just says, graphics by Yaroslav, sound effects by Ian. Just popped it out as a separate thing to you so you can get the full majesty. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? It's a nice. I mean, it goes into quite a bit of detail on the design as well. So we'll talk about that. But I really like the design. It's very sort of. It goes on to explain it all, but it's sort of very similar to the beacon, but also mixes in kind of elements of like the Tesla coils from the Red Alert series, which is a deliberate reference. But we'll come on to all that. But yeah, I also quite like the sound. There's a nice little electric element to it of like, you know, that way sometimes if you get a microphone too close to electricity or something like that, or a speaker in fact, you know, you actually get, you know, a bit of static kind of pickup on the speaker, and it'll sound, you know, hummy and sort of buzzy and that sort of thing, and that's a really nice little touch, I think, in the sound of it. And then you got the actual beam which you know, makes a kind of ripping electric sound. It's really well done. The Tesla turret is an electric turret like the laser turret. While the laser turret only takes up a 2x2 area, the Tesla turret is a much larger, taking up a 4x4 area. The Tesla turret is much more powerful, but it is also much more power hungry. Not only is the energy per shot higher, but the passive power draw is also significant. It's worth mentioning that we've actually reduced the laser turret's passive power draw, so the two electric turrets have more differences and are better in different situations. So it's interesting about them dropping the passive power draw for lasers. That was always one of the big disadvantages of them, that you would need quite a big electric grid. You know, if you wanted to have a lot of turrets covering your walls, then you needed to be able to supply them with a lot of power, even when they were doing absolutely nothing. And when you have a really big base, that's far more of a concern than the actual like responding to attacks, because the responses to attacks, you know, the attacks come in and maybe like 20 turrets or something activate, so it's not very many, and so you do need to power that spike in power, but it's much more of a cost to do all of your walls just have these passive electric turrets on. So it'd be interesting to see how much that's actually come down by it. This machine is not simply a Tesla coil. Technically, it's more like a compact particle accelerator that fires a proton or ion beam. Once the primary beam hits a target, they are strongly positively charged, causing secondary arcs of lightning that can chain to other nearby targets. Sounds a bit wonky on the physics, that, but we'll let them get away with it. But yeah, it does look more like a particle beam, if I'm honest. You know, it looks more like an accelerated particle beam rather than lightning as such. I think particularly it's got this central core to it, which I say looks like a particle beam rather than, you know, if it was just the arcing electricity, you'd expect it just to be the outside wiggly bit, which is what the secondary beams are. This chain lightning effect makes the Tesla turret much better against groups of enemies. The Tesla turret deals a decent 60 electric damage per second, but damage comparisons are difficult to generalise because some enemies may be weaker to electrical damage, and damage bonuses from technologies make a significant difference. Also, this is just the damage per target, and the lightning can jump to secondary targets 10 times in a chain, and they all take the full damage. This next little video just demonstrates the chaining effect. So you've got a single turret here and it is hitting multiple biters. They kind of rush in and it hits the first one and then it chains to basically all of them. And then it does a second where effectively this thing it looks like against small and medium-sized biters, it's basically a single kill weapon, a bit like hitting them with maybe sort of a explosive grenade or explosive missile turret, only because of this chaining thing, it's like a bigger area that it covers. But say against small and medium biters and spitters, it appears to be just a one-shot kill, so it's very effective at that level. I love this chaining effect. It's really, really cool. Because it does feel random, like you see here, like it does 2 at once on that one, which is really cool. As with other turrets, higher quality tiers give the turret more range. The base range is 30, and the range at Legendary is 45. The Tesla turret is special, in that higher quality also increases the chance for the secondary chain lightning to fork and hit additional targets. The base fork chance per jump is 5%, and increases to 30% if Legendary. So I'm taking that to mean the point, like where it was saying here, where you see the second one basically. In fact, I'll pause this one because I've got the video open. So on this one, if we play this through, we're getting it chaining to 1, 2, 3, and it appears to go through them linearly. So it just goes, hits the targets basically in an order. Okay. The second lot though, as we go here, you see we get here, because this appears to be a forking point basically, and then it forks here again. What it's saying, I think, is that, say you've got 20 enemies, if it doesn't do a fork, then it will hit 10 of them. If it does a fork at any point, then the fork can hit the same number of enemies as were left, I would guess. So, say it hits 5, and then it forks, one arc can then hit another 5, and the other arc can hit another 5. So in other words, you're getting a lot more sort of free damage out of a single attack. That's my interpretation of what it's saying, but we'll have to see how it actually works in game. But again, this makes this absolutely devastating against small and medium biters and spitters. They're basically just one of these, and your entire thing is defended. The range is also huge as well. I mean, I'm assuming this is a legendary one. I'm not, au fait enough with the distances and stuff, but this looks a very long distance. A gun turret, I'm pretty sure would end about here, just from experience of putting them down somewhere there. And then a flamer turret would be something like that, maybe? And so this one seems to be going all the way out here. I guess the first thing it hits is technically there. So that could be 30, couldn't it? If that's, say, that would be about right for the flamer turret. Yes, so a flamer turret has that minimum range thing, which is 6. Can you see that? But a maximum range of 30. So in it, essentially, the Tesla turret has its maximum range set at the same as the flamer turret. So this would be a flamer turret. If that was a flamer turret next to it, then you would get the same sort of attack range. And so this extra damage is all happening after that distance, so everything is hit. And of course, if this is out to 45, it would be way out here that it would be shooting. That's just monstrous. Wow. Damage isn't the only focus of this turret, though. It's equally about crowd control. The electrical arcs stun targets, halting their movement for a moment, zapping them back a small amount, and then slowing them slightly for a short time once the stun wears off. This is great for keeping enemies away from your stuff, or even interrupting their attacks if they manage to get close enough. It helps keep enemies clustered, which is great for area effects like flamethrower turrets or explosive rockets. Also, locking enemies down to a small area away from your walls is exactly what your flamethrower turrets want. Interesting. So it applies a stun, which is an effect that the landmine and I think the discharge event does it as well. As it happens, I'm right in the middle of editing my combat video, and I have speculated about a Tesla turret, and a lot of my speculations, it turns out, are true. As it says, it's inspired by the Red Alert Tesla coil. That is where I was basing my speculations on as well. But yeah, basically, what it's saying is that it stuns them and slows them. So it's applying both the stun, like say the landmine or discharge defense, but also slowdown effects, so slowdown capsules. So effectively, what it's doing is it's at the range that your flamethrowers are going to kick in. Because one of the things with flamethrowers is they have a big lag. They'll shoot out because that arc that they jet out, it will land, and say if your biters are here, it will land behind them, and then it sort of catches up with them. And that's really useful for the flamethrower turret, because if you've got a big group coming in, it'll be, dousing the far ones in fuel, and they'll be running into the fuel and stuff. But it does mean that they can get quite close before the nearest ones, especially when they go into this running attack. So this basically would stun them. So if a flamethrower was then dumping fuel on it, anything that is surviving, that is, say, a large biter or a behemoth, is then slowed down and like really subjected to concentrated fire attack as well. And of course then if they get super close, you've also got their lasers and gun turrets to finish them off, sort of thing. So yeah, it might get around one of these things where the big responses you get to artillery could dash in and sort of attack your walls, and they can often get to your walls and do a lot of damage before the current turrets you've got can take them out. But this guy would stun them all, so that it'll all just be stood there, and then they get doused in flame of fuel. So yeah, sounds like it really sort of fits in to a sort of a jigsaw approach. And then if you add in missile turrets as well, and they may be launching explosive rockets, there's almost nothing going to get even close to your walls, I would have said. Assuming there are biters that aren't completely resistant to electric damage or explosive damage, etc. The turret is more expensive and must be made on Fulgora, so for a while at least you can't use it everywhere. The synergy with other turrets means that there's still a good incentive to include a few Tesla turrets to back up key locations. Artillery forts are a great early use case because it's an area you know will be attacked, and you only need a few Tesla turrets to make a big difference. It can also unlock a handheld Tesla gun, which requires ammo but otherwise functions in a similar way to the Tesla turret. The gun version is geared more towards crowd control than other handheld weapons. Compared to the Tesla turret, it can chain for longer and has a higher forking chance. So this video then obviously just shows the engineer running away from a bunch of biters and then turning around and attacking them with a Tesla gun. And you can really see the forking there because it's hitting these few and then it's forking out to all of those. Doesn't indicate if it does the same damage. It looks like maybe, although these are big biters, aren't they? They're not mediums, so they would be more resistant. But yeah, it doesn't mention what the damage is compared to the turret, but I would guess the same. But yeah, you can really see the stun and slowdown effect in this one as well. It's not as apparent in the previous video because it's just killing them straight away. But yeah, you can sort of see the slowdown and stuff that's applied to them, and that, they kind of react to it properly. It may not do as much damage as some other weapons, but the extra bounces make it easier for a single gun to control a group of enemies. This is ideal to keep you safe, while other sources boost your damage, like cluster grenades, destroyer capsules, and personal lasers. Combined arms approaches, eh? Combined arms approaches. Game design. By Arundel. As many of you know, there's a Tesla gun in my mod, Space Exploration. It's one of the most popular weapons because it's so fun to use. I always wanted to make a turret version, but there's never a practical way to do it. In the mod, a handheld version is fine, because at most, only a few people would use it at once in multiplayer. If you had more than 50 turrets using the same effect, then you'd quickly see it slowing the game down, because the mod would need to search for enemies with a Lua script for every bounce, and that's a slow process. So yeah, this is coming into this thing again, that mods are often, a source of slowdown, because basically it has to go out to a separate script that it runs, and then it comes back into the game, tells it the result sort of thing. And of course, the point there is that if it's doing this bouncing and it can do the similar number of forks of whatever it was, 10 or what have you, then each time it does that, it's got to find a new target to fork to, or work out there is no target to fork to. So, or, bounce to, as it were. So the point being that if you had them as turrets and you lined up just a stack of these turrets, and even doing them on different planets, where they're running simultaneously all the time, it's going out every single time to do this check. And so the more turrets you put down, the more checks it's doing in parallel, and suddenly your UPS just absolutely plummets. And of course, the difference being if it's just handheld, you're literally firing it once. Maybe you're doing a multiplayer, so there's like 4 of you in the game. You're all using one. That's it though. That's all the calculations it's doing. But turrets, you could easily put, 50 down sort of thing. When I was making the first gameplay prototype for Space Age, it was a throw things at the wall and see what sticks sort of time. We knew we were adding an electromagnetism themed planet to the game, so a Tesla turret was a perfect fit. I added a Tesla turret that could be unlocked on the planet, but again, the old problem of engine support for features that don't exist yet. At the start, it just had to be a turret that shot the destroyer robot electric beam, but of course there was a plan for it to do much more. Unlike the rocket turret, which obviously fires rockets, the Tesla turret is more or less a clean state in terms of its effects. This means it can be more than just damage, and I saw this as a good opportunity to make a turret with synergies, the sort of thing that you might find in a dedicated tower defense game. A short, shocked, stun-like effect is a nice pairing with electrical damage, so that was added as one of the main non-damage features. Visually, it didn't look very impactful though. The enemy just pauses for a moment. Then, I tried adding a small pushback effect, and that made all the difference. By changing their position slightly, it looks like they jump or twitch from the electricity, which is perfect. Mechanically, it's a nice combination with the stun by hindering their movement even more. Concept art by Arundel. So his first picture here is just captioned early experiments pre-version 1. I'm actually going to zoom this in, here we go, to give you a better look. Got three very different sort of concepts. But this here, look, it's an actual proper gun. It's a concept was to have it as an actual cannon mounted on a kind of what we call it, like a support basically, and that rotates around. Throughout that's common, and it does go on to mention this, is this idea of it being in the ground, being sort of dug into the ground. Very much like the beacons, there's a real clear reference point, as it were, into the newer beacon design. Somebody said on Reddit, and I agreed wholeheartedly, that I'd love to get an art book of the concept art and the final in-game art and that sort of thing. And I think if they don't do that, they're missing a trick. I'd love to own an actual physical copy, just an actual book, but they could easily do a concept art book as a DLC, like the soundtrack is on the site, and I would absolutely get that in a heartbeat, especially for the space. Could just do it for Space Age, but I'd love to see the concept art and stuff for the original game as well. Especially the evolution, because the game has changed so much. At its early versions, it looked very, very different to what it does even now. The concept art for the Tesla turret was tricky because there were a lot of inspirations that I wanted to follow, but they all took the design close to things that needed to be avoided. This made the design process very nuanced and full of pitfalls. Firstly, the overall structure should be vaguely reminiscent in shape to a nostalgic Tesla defense from something like Command & Conquer, but it can't be too similar. And I mentioned this before, and it's clearly inspired by that. But if you've never seen, I know they've not done a red alert game in like decades, so if you've never seen one, this is actually, I've got this up because it shows all three. So this was the original game way back in the day. And it's a pretty simple thing, but the ball on the top basically, and then you've got the coils around it, sort of thing. This is number 2. This was Red Alert 2, and again you've got the ball on the top as the key thing. You can't really see them there because the lightning arcing around it, but there are the coils around the side, and it starts to gain more of a distinct structure around the bottom. This is Red Alert 3, where you've got a weird thing where, I always remember this, it suddenly acquires this solid base to it. And so that effectively it's that sat on top of like a stone brick structure, because you can see that part is basically just that part of the top. So it was an odd, because it stepped backwards, so the design went from actually fairly simple because low polygons to like more fancy, and then it actually got simpler again. But yeah, so this was the Tesla coil from Red Alert, and the idea was that you can actually see it here as well. These were a defensive structure, and they would zap any enemies coming in. You can kind of see it there, and it would chain between them. That was one of its feature. It would zap multiple things. But what you could also do, you had a Tesla trooper in the game, and you could basically get multiple of them. It's a bit like when you were, when games that have defensive towers, you can put troops inside them, and then the more troops you have, obviously the more effective it has, more enemies it can shoot. And so the Tesla trooper was that for them. But what they would do is actually just charge the turret, so they wouldn't actually fire themselves at anything. You'd get them stood around and they would be zapping, putting their power in, and then what that would allow it to do is to hit multiple targets. So it would, I think it could do 2 as its as its default thing, but even if it's just 1, and that each guy would basically allow it to attack more targets. I think it also boosted the damage as well, but yeah, the basic idea was that these were like a charge up, so the more you had, the more powerful the turret itself was. So yeah, I always remember them. The voice lines are always really great as well. Between the old beacon design and the new beacon design, there was an intermediate version shown in Friday Fact 339. The design didn't work out well for a beacon because it was too visually dominant compared to the machines it surrounded. As some people pointed out at the time, it looked too much like a Tesla turret. I wanted to capture some of this version's look in the new design, but the problem is that our current beacon is also based on this design. So just going to go, I wouldn't normally do the Friday Facts things, but these were the things. We used to have this big, dirty, great, solid lump of a beacon, way back in the day. And then they had this Friday Facts basically going for some ideas. Basically, it was this spiky tower thing that came out. A lot of people criticised it. It looked like a bit like an octopus head as well. When it had these these like legs on it, it looked like a head or something like that of some sort of robot or something like that. And the sort of problem really with it was that it was like really like visually dominant in the space. It didn't blend in, and so all you would really see is the beacons. They stood out a mile, and so they sort of scrapped that idea and went for a bit of a simpler thing. And the big thing that got taken off really is this like head part, basically. So now it's just basically this spike that only comes out the top, and it doesn't overlap. This was the other thing. It made it so visually dominant because it overlapped with whatever was behind it, and now the beacon is specifically designed so that even though it looks like it's in a hole and it's coming out of the hole, the top part of it doesn't really go past the border, so it just sort of stops sort of there-ish. I think it does poke just ever so slightly past, but yeah, the basic point was that this sort of design here, and you notice the sort of eyeball thing, that's kind of what's being pulled over into the new thing, as well as the legs. It was important that the Tesla turret didn't look too close to the current beacon. They can have some similarities because they're both high voltage systems, but they can't be visually confusing. It needs to convey high voltage and an electrical effect, but it isn't actually an omnidirectional Tesla coil, it's a proton beam on a rotating turret. This means that it needs a front face, and the face needs to rotate before it can attack, like all of our turrets. And lastly, it should show some relation to the laser turret to suggest that it's part of the same family, but shouldn't look like a scaled up laser turret. The design needed a few revisions because Albert, V and I had different opinions on how much of these influences was too much or too little. Also, often it wouldn't be too obvious that something is too similar to something else from the line art, but it would become apparent in the shaded version. There are a lot of adjustments before getting to version 1, and that didn't really follow a linear process, so it's hard to show, but this is as far as I got with version 1 before we decided it was too similar to a beacon and not enough like the laser turret. Okay, so we've got a picture here, caption saying, Concept Art version 1, testing that it works with different player colours. So yeah, all that's going on here is a colour swap between each of these. It's exactly the same design, they're not different design versions, and I would say it is very similar to how the current beacon looks, that it's recessed into a hole in the ground, and that you've got sort of the 4 corner parts going on, and bits and pieces coming into the hole and going up to the actual poking out part. You can see very clearly, there is a Tesla coil in there, so you've got that part to it, and this head part, is clearly inspired by that older idea for the revised beacon, and that's capturing this element of it's a proton beam and it's a head that fires that out, sort of thing. So that's clearly stayed there for a while. Lots of lovely incidental details, like the arcing thing, like the mad scientist. What do they call them? I can't remember what they're called, but where you have the 2 wires and the electric arc goes between them and moves up, sort of thing. It's got one of those on it, and all sorts of lovely little details on it. But yeah, it is very, very similar to the beacon. Now, I'm assuming here just to note that, because this is talked about as concept 1, and I think this one is basically concept 2 was essentially this, but maybe tweaked a bit, and so we now move on to version 3. The final design ended up being version 3. The main intention behind the changes from version 1 to version 3 were cover up the hole a bit more, remove the electric fence around the hole, have the diagonal support like the laser turret. So those elements basically are the hole here is this this hole in the ground, basically. So make that a bit more covered up, so it's not as deep like the beacon design. Electric fence is this part here, so that sort of curve going around the edge. And then the final part that have the diagonal supports like the laser turret. So this currently has only like little arms here. And of course the laser turret has those, it says the diagonal arms. And you can kind of see them on this next picture here, where these are the diagonal arms, the supporting structures that go out at diagonals to the, to the normal square. Everything is connected though, so in the end only the head ended up staying the same. The caption does say, at first glance it may look like it's the same but taller, but if you look closer it's like spot the difference, but everything is different. So spot the similarity, I guess, is the point there. These big pipe conduit things are one of the things that really makes, whenever I see them, it just instantly in my head it goes Akira, basically. Because particularly when they went down into the cryo chamber, if you've never seen it, I guess that's spoilers, but they go down into the cryo chamber and it has these great big, conduit pipes and all sorts of wires just going everywhere on the design. And to me, when I see Arundel doing those things, it just screams that to me. I mean, it's obviously not a unique design point for Akira, but it's that sort of cyberpunk, everything is wired together and there's connections between everything and information and data must flow, so there must be wires and circuits and transformers and capacitors and all this sort of electrical gubbins that is very cyberpunk. So the final design has a hint of nostalgia for our retro-futuristic look, but not too much. A hint of Beacon version 2's face, but not too much. A hint of the Beacon's high-voltage underground capacitor bank look, but not too much. A hint of the laser turret in the diagonal supports and green capacitor to the bottom right. And finally, a hint of the Tesla coil look in the silhouette, while not actually looking like a Tesla coil. Tesla coil, as I say, being the red alert one. Unfortunately, because it's moved in, you can't probably see it, so we'll show a separate version. So yeah, so this is it here, the full concept art version. Obviously this got adapted into a 3D model and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, you can see it all here. The colouring, I believe, is to do with materials. Basically that's when he's referencing the materials, because the caption on it just says version 3 line art with material assignment, and I believe that's kind of what the colours are showing, is what materials each is made of and which ones are going to be consistent materials. So in other words, make these look the same, because they're obviously not bright yellow and stuff in the actual design, and the orange is clearly player character colour controlled, if you see what I mean. The last part of the design was the electrical beam itself. The destroyer robot beam is okay for a short distance, but doesn't work so well for a long line. The Tesla turret deserves an effect with more punch, but also is useful for a number of reasons to be able to differentiate the primary proton beam with the secondary bounces. The primary beam is brighter and has a straight laser-like core and electrical arcing on the fringes, whereas the secondary bounces don't have the secondary straight line and are just electrical arcs. I think that means the primary straight line. So in other words, the main beam, the one that comes out, shoots out of the turret, has this core line, which is like the proton beam basically, so in a Ghostbusters type way. That's the straight line coming out of the proton pack, the proton beam, and then the electrical stuff arcs around it. So that's the sort of an electrical discharge going on at the same time. But after it's hit a target and then it's doing the bounces, that central line goes away and it's just the electricity lines that go around. The initial design for the main beam using the existing segment system. Repeating segments are highlighted for clarity, and that will come up later on. But basically you can see how you got, for example, on the greeny one, you've got that sort of Y-shaped bit there, and that Y-shaped bit is repeated, and then you've got that sort of loop there, which is that loop there, although it crosses over into another one. You've got that connecting bit there, the connecting bit there. You've got the two lines coming down the bottom. I'm highlighting that because that's what this is going to come on to do. We're going to get quite technical now, and basically the point is that if you did this current approach, this is fine when you've got a destroyer capsule, and it's doing a very short range blasts. But if you then stick all of those together, it becomes really obvious that it's repeating the parts, basically. Because these are literally just, this is the part and it's repeated, this is the part and it's repeated, this is the part and it's repeated, and you can see that very clearly. Final graphics, the Electric Beam Saga by Yaroslav. So yeah, just to note, this is going to get a bit more techy. It's still, I find this sort of stuff fascinating, but if you want to just skip to the speculation, then do feel free. When I started working on the Tesla turret, it was kind of a vacation. Far from the usual complex projects I take on, it was a relaxing little thing. Making most of the model was very straightforward. It went smoothly, and I didn't have much to say about that part. That is, until it came to the beam of electricity itself. That's where I found all the complexity I am used to. Though the fact that I am capable and willing to over-engineer even the simplest of tasks might have complicated it a tiny little bit. The turret base has a number of electric arcs that move around it while it is firing, but also when it is idle with power. These arcs always go from one point on the structure to another. We already solved that problem for accumulators, beacons and the lightning connectors. The arcs on the Tesla turret are a little different, but the same approach worked, so they weren't too much trouble. That's referring to these arcs here, the sort of little twiddly ones. So when we see it just sat here, it has those arcs moving around it, and obviously when it fires they sort of leap into action as well, but it's got sort of fairly static beams most of the time, and then it sort of has a variety of ones, and basically that's roughly the same as the electric arcs on the accumulators, for when they're just normal and when they're discharging. It has different intensities basically. Electric arcs for beam weapons are a different story and prove to be a curious thing to recreate. They have limited structure. They arc, from point A to B, but everything that happens in between is very chaotic and unpredictable, yet follows a certain rhythm. It is the kind of structured chaos that is very obvious when done wrong, and, as such, hard to replicate. But then there is a more significant complication. The beam would need to be able to hit targets both close to and far away from the turret itself, and as such, should be able to scale. So yeah, it's that thing of, it's an electric arc, so it's going to kind of just follow the path of least resistance in the air, and that means it will jigger around, and go all sorts of directions. Even though it's going from one point to a fairly fixed point, it would do so in a more sort of chaotic way, and that's unpredictable essentially. So it would look chaotic even when you're looking at it, and of course that makes it more difficult because it's easy to draw a relatively simple shape and just repeat that like we saw in the other image, but then it's very obvious that it's a repeated image, so it's got to be some sort of randomization going on. The other problem is that this thing at a legendary quality level has a range of 45, so it's not that it's a tiny little thing like a destroyer capsule, and therefore if it repeats a bit, it's not much of a problem. If it's doing it over huge distances, like here, it becomes very obvious to the eye that these are just repeated segments. The obvious starting point was the electric discharge beam that already existed in the game, a simple yet practical construct. Its ins and outs are very simple. We take a looping animation of a single electric beam, split into 6 distinct arcs, and then cut that into 6 parts, 1 arc each. Since the arcs start and end at the same points, we can repeat the segment as many times as we need to reach a necessary length of the beam, and then just slap a little starting and ending effect on both sides. Simple, easy, and, unfortunately, very underwhelming when scaled up to the size of the Tesla turret. So this is it here. The basic idea is they've got one, wiggly line that they can then chop up essentially and repeat. And as it shows there, it just becomes a sort of a dancing, like wibbly line effect basically. So it's not really, it doesn't really even look like lightning at this scale when it's so long, because it's not sort of aggressive and sharp enough. It's more sort of just a wiggly line going along basically. One of the problems, the punchiness of the beam, was somewhat easy to fix. The system was working, it just needed more attention and care to look better at big scale. A few improvements to the process itself, so as to limit the loss of sanity, were not a bad idea either. The other problem relates to what I mentioned before, the concept of structured chaos. With the new beam being bigger, reaching further and staying on screen longer, it became obvious the chaos on display is just a simulacrum, with clearly recognisable, and thus predictable, structure. In other words, yeah, because it's clearly something they're doing to fake randomness that isn't actually random. By extending it to such a long thing, a long beam, it's obvious that it's just the same pattern repeated. When it's done very, very small scale, you kind of can't tell as it flips between the different modes and animations and stuff. But when you extend it for so long, you can see the same thing repeating, and so it's obvious it's not random. To put it simply, in a small beam, like for the destroyer capsule, the range is low, so it usually only repeats once, if at all, and the repetitions are not as obvious because no part of the beam is very distinct. For the Tesla turret, the beam is long. It often needs to repeat many times, and each segment is more extravagant, so repetitions are more obvious. Every segment of the beam is locked to the same timing, so that it always matches up with the segment before it. But that means that part of the beam jumps to the left, then exactly the same thing happens as multiple points along the beam at exactly the same time, and looks very unnatural. Something needed to change, so Erendel, Vaclav and I started brainstorming, with me mostly just storming, and we came up with 2 crucial improvements to the system. For the first one, each of the arc segments became twice as long without changing the spacing. That meant huge portions overlapped. With a central proton beam working as a base or grounding, the arcs could go much crazier, and we didn't need to care about how they attached to one another. Furthermore, this approach made the separation into segments look more natural and less constructed. The real deal, though, was the approach to randomization. An obvious improvement you could think of would be to use randomized segments instead of using them in order from first to 6th and repeating. Yet, if there is one thing I've learned working on Space Platform Borders and the Platform Hub, it is that RNG gods do exist, and they suffer not an artist, lo the designer. Nothing kills the feeling of natural chaos as surely as a few copies of the same lightning repeated at uniform offsets. So the basic idea is that when they're chopping it up, don't chop it up as linear, same length segments. So in other words, you have this segment and then offset, basically an overlap, which is what's being shown in the picture that's coming up, where you basically take a segment and you say, right, well, you can overlap it with the next segment by a varying amount. And so by doing that on a presumably random RNG basis, it then makes them look, all meshed together, basically. So even though you get the same bits repeating, it's not as obvious because they're overlapped in different ways with different segments. The other problem that seems to be is that they're repeating these 6 segments linearly. So it's just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And of course that's giving you that very, very obvious repeat pattern. A different approach was needed, and Erendel provided a brilliant one. Instead of randomizing the order of the segments we use, we randomize the offsets of the animation. Since each animation loops into itself, starting it at the end is not a problem, and the chaotic nature of an electric beam means that often just a few frames of an offset is sufficient to differentiate from other instances. So basically what they're saying is that the animation goes through a loop and it returns to where it was, so that it's a perfectly looping design, so that you can just keep playing it over and over, and it's not got a jump. There's not a sort of a jump to the beginning. It's when it gets to the end point, it's at the beginning point. And so what they're saying is that if you offset the point at which it starts playing the animation, so in other words, if it's 20 frames long, you offset it by 3 frames, you offset it by 7 frames, you offset it by 5 frames for each of the segments, then because they do look different each time, you're not getting that same repeat thing. So in other words, part of the problem of the repeat is that you're seeing frame 3 and frame 3 of the same one just offset in distance. Where if you make it so that frame 3 is throwing when frame 7 is showing, then they look different. So you can't quite see. You'd have to be sat there really analysing it to work out, that's the same one, it's just starting at a different time. With all that out of the way, the last thing remaining was to roll my sleeves up and get to the technical part. The system we used for electricity before is a very simple one. It's based off of a very simple ribbon shape that is then displaced using various random maps. If you do not know 3D graphics, you can think of the displacement as the way waves would move a ribbon floating on a lake. Though in our case, instead of just waves, we also have a miniature storm displacing the ribbon in a very chaotic manner, creating a visual not unlike an arc of electricity. The shape of the ribbon can be further adjusted using hooks, special objects that can pinch and move the centre of the arc around, those will become very important in the next step. So this basically just shows that in action. These are the ribbons. So literally think of a ribbon, like a piece of silk ribbon, that you would tie your hair with. Not that I've got hair, but a piece of ribbon that's sat on a lake, basically, or a body of water, and so the waves are moving around, and it moves up and down, moves left and right, etc., etc. And then they have a basic point that they've got other things that are doing other adjustments to it as well. So these various random maps, they're basically pushing and pulling the ribbon in various random directions. And so because of having really big differences in the maps, it can do sharper movements and quicker movements and twistier movements and all that sort of stuff. It's they're using a 3D thing to do a 2D effect essentially, and so it causes much more random pattern than is probably actually in the underlying thing. But this is effectively the result. But basically you have, you notice these have exactly the same sort of anchor points at the beginning and end, and then the amount that they wibble around is dictated by these maps essentially. And then this is just showing it as a kind of a outline, basically an alpha, and it's got a glow effect around it as well. So it's exactly the same. It's just it's taking out that line detail essentially. And then what you've got to remember is that they're going to offset these so that they overlap physically. So this part would be overlapping some random amount into this one, but also then changing the animation so that even if two of these are, because there are only 6 here. So the idea is that, if this is repeated at the end here, the timing is offset, so you wouldn't be able to tell as easily that it was exactly the same one, because they're all basically repeating in exactly the same order. What we have now is what is used in existing and new buildings to render electricity. But for something more glorious, like a Tesla turret, we need to go much further. The next step would be to increase the violent jumps typical of electric arcs. We could use the hooks to do that, but that would require tons of manual effort, as trying to recreate chaos manually is typically quite tricky and tedious. Instead, I decided to create a new system of deformations, which I named in my usual fashion, the insanity drivers. So this is all, this is the animation being done with the maps and all that sort of stuff. And the idea being that they want to turn this into proper electricity arcs. So these would be like the ones on capacitors and all that sort of stuff, where it's between 2 fixed points and it sort of moves around and wiggles a bit, and that's what they're using them for. To make it look like actual electricity, they wanted to make it more chaos, and particularly with it being the Tesla turret, make it more powerful, and the arcs are even more jiggling around and even more random and that sort of thing. And it's an interesting point Jaroslav mentions about random being difficult. Humans are actually pretty bad at random, and computers cannot do random at all. Computers are entirely deterministic. Whenever you're doing an RNG, it's created using an algorithm, and it's actually, when you map out random numbers that a computer generates, they're not random at all. It's just, it gives an impression of random to a user, basically. Basically, the point is that random is very difficult for humans to do. I suppose the other point as well is if you're going to come up with lots and lots and lots of these, then it gets really tedious to do it all by hand, basically. So he was looking to come up with a way of sort of automating it. His work is very simple. I have a set of randomly rotating objects, rotators, and then another set of objects that reads that rotation and turns it into movement, drivers. The gimmick rests on the way 3D graphics perceive rotation. Any rotation beyond 360 degrees, a full circle, resets to 0 and continues from there. That means that if a rotator spins on an axis for 2 full rotations, an attached driver will then move from point A to B during the first rotation, then teleport back to A and move to B again. Now imagine the same, but with rotators spinning wildly on 3 axes in a random manner. Or better yet, watch it in action below. So these things are rotating around, basically, and they're doing so in an XYZ, full 3D axis set, so basically they can rotate in any direction in 3D, and it's then taking presumably some part of that rotation and translating it into a 2D movement. And part of the point is this, you see how these jump, basically, so that's the point of when it gets to going back to its origin. So once it's gone round 360 degrees, it basically just jumps back to the beginning. And of course this translation won't be in, it won't have rotated round because it's going in a circle. It'll be flat, so it'll be over here sort of thing, and suddenly it'll jump to the beginning, and it's that jump that Jaroslav is after. Now it's a very simple matter to attach our hooks, controlling the ribbon to the drivers. That produces adequate results, though I did have to fine-tune them here and there by manually adjusting the position of the hooks. I thought of that step as merely a slight adjustment, but it turned out to be much more important. That human intervention into the randomised chaos managed to place it somewhere in between fully procedural and fully manual approaches, so exactly where I wanted it at. And here we see the results basically. So these extra bits here, that sort of cross that's happening, that's the hook basically. That's the thing pulling it additionally away from where it was. So we go from this where it's jiggling around and being fine, but then it goes to this where you get these sudden jumps where it goes, and that gives it that jerky, sudden, rapid movement that's happening here. And so it's jumping across the place like an electric discharge would. It randomly finds the path of least resistance. As it is now, the arc stays attached to the central beam, no matter how violently the insanity drivers push them away. I wanted to address that and cut the arcs in certain places, giving the illusion of the arcs tearing away from the beam. It would be a lot of work to do it exactly that way though. Moving the end of the arc away and back would affect a lot of other things already in place. I decided to look for a little cheat then, and that cheat was to selectively narrow the ribbon from the end to a point that it disappears. Technically the arc was still going from A to B, but visually it was violently ripping apart from the beam due to the amount of power it carried. This bit's really clever, I gotta say. So the arc is this full connected line between the two, and then every so often, because it's a this ribbon, they're basically then saying, right, well, narrow the end of the ribbon, basically. So I'll narrow it to 0, so it disappears. And therefore it looks like the arc is moving off of the thing. The line is still there, and there's still wiggly part of the line. Like this one jumps loads. And the line is still there. It's just you can't see it because it's been narrowed to 0. So it's giving this impression that the arc is, finding other things to discharge to, forking away from where it mainly is. And then it'll jump back because it's suddenly... that's the most favourable path. With the main arcs in place, I wanted to reuse the system to create further, smaller arcs. I was very happy with the shrinking trick used before, and wanted to use a similar effect with the smaller lightning, just on a bigger scale. The solution I came up with was to use a method called back-face culling, which, in layman's terms, means that I made the backside of the ribbon invisible. Since the ribbon is thrown around by the miniature storm of the displacement, it twists and rotates a lot, and if you only draw the front side of it, it adds up to a very nice supportive effect. In other words, if you imagine the ribbon is a flat 2D thing, as it's being jerked around in this process, it's actually flipping around as well. So it's flipping from being that orientation to some form of upside down, just because of how they're rotating it around. Now obviously then when they're rendering it, they're just showing you it as a solid outline. So you can't actually tell that it's the back, it's the front, or what have you. It loses that sort of 2D-ness to it. So what they're saying is that rather than when it flips over a bit like that, when it gets, to a point where it would show the back, they basically just don't draw the back part. And that then cuts out parts of the line, makes it thinner, etc., because you're getting this illusion effect of it. If that's the flat of it there and it's that wide, when it moves diagonal, it becomes thinner. But if you then move it even further and it goes so that the back is showing, but then you don't draw that back, it goes invisible. So effectively it loses parts out of its segment. So you can then see this here, where these have got little bits missing because the ribbon is obviously turned round at that part. And so it looks like it's a jittery, dotty sort of an effect. I would have to say, as it's portrayed here, looks less like lightning, but this is like a sub part to it, so it's extra little bits. So it's kind of adding flesh to it. So I don't know that this would work as well just if it was this, but if you combine it with the full thing, like here, so you get these secondary bits and pieces coming off and doing that effect, then it kind of works better. At that point I was pretty happy with the effects, but one thing was standing out to me. The combined effect was very dynamic and aggressive, yet it lacked directionality. It seemed to just sit there instead of delivering a concentrated dosage of freedom electricity straight to its target. That is why I ended up adding a second layer of secondary arcs, this time travelling at high speed towards the end of the beam. Even though these are minuscule and hard to spot, even when you know what to look for, it was enough to trick the brain into perceiving the subtle movements without it being too obvious and overwhelming. So this is them then, basically. So this is moving along now, very quickly, and you can actually see it sort of, they move along, they're sort of, just sort of jittering forward. And so by having that across the entire length of the beam, it looks like the beam is moving forward, but it's a very subtle effect. And I must say, I can't actually see this, you can't pick it out of that beam, but it's clearly sufficiently there enough that you get the feel for it moving forward, even if you can't actually see the individual bits doing the movement. With all these systems in place, I wanted just a single last piece of the puzzle to fall in place. The lightning forks splitting away from more pronounced arcs. Remember how I mentioned adjusting the arc to travel to a different point B was going to be a lot of work? Well, so it was, since those lightnings were added by hand, adjusted frame by frame to fit the rest of the animation. Even with just a few of those, the amount of moving elements grew very quickly, and I needed to seek ways to preserve my sanity by automating my workspace itself, by making sure certain elements are drawn or hidden only when they are necessary. You can see a bit of that in action below, and the caption says the places where the lightning would show up are simplified, and the state of the lightning shows up only when it is animated and visible. And these are the forks basically, so this one shows it quite well, I think, where it comes up here and it's got the forks and they're being sort of added on. So it sounds like all of those forky parts were manually added, which must have been quite painful. Another part worth mentioning is how distinct those shapes become. And distinct shapes are a bane when working with anything repeating, which we come up against a lot here. With distinct shapes and movements, it's very easy to lock onto the pattern and see the fakery. Yet despite that, due to the way we randomise starting frames of every segment, that is not a problem in our case. With all these parts put together, we can see the final result of the beam. So you've got that solid core, that line in the middle that is the sort of proton-y beam. It's obviously got a wiggly part around it as well. I don't know if that's part of that lightning effect or just an added animation. But then this is the lightning going around it, and you can see it sort of jumping off and reattaching to it, and the forks going on, and some bits randomly coming up. This thing of where it culls the end, it sort of chops the end down and makes them look separate even though they aren't. It's really effective, isn't it? And I don't know about you, but although you can sort of see the same bits repeating eventually, you sort of see these like fingery tendrils here. Eventually they come back, but it does it at such a time frame, because you've got to remember this beam is not going to be active for like as long as this. So every time it fires, it could have, if this is a behemoth biter it's hitting, then sure, it could be going for a while. But you're not going to really see it repeating because too much, because it's too long, as it were. The repeat is too distant for you to say, oh yeah, that's repeating over and over. And certainly this thing of the same bits of animation being shown at the same time at different points is definitely not there. Even though, as I say, you can see that little fingery thing animation there happens there, and there. So it is clearly repeating, but because it's offset and it's not as obvious what's going on, it fools your brain into thinking it is much more random than it is, if you see what I mean. It's still doing the repeats, it's just it's sufficiently complicated that you can't really tell. All that was left to do was prepare the special effects for the Tesla turret's counterpart, muzzle flash and the hit effect. Scale down and adjust the beam to serve as the secondary chain as well. Okay, so it sounds like that beam is actually like a mini version of it. That's interesting. Post-process everything. So give it all the effects and the light, colouring and lighting and glowing and stuff. Then we put it all together in game and, well, I hope you enjoy the possibility for throwing a sick rave party. Caption just says, biters trying to sneak into the club. This is actually quite a long video. I might leave it running while I do the speculation bit, but it's actually quite nice, like 6 minutes long. And basically these turrets are just annihilating a whole slew of biters and nest. What's interesting about this in particular, and I say we'll play it from the beginning when we go through it, but it only actually fires on things at like about this sort of distance. You know, this is sort of its maximum range in terms of the thing. But the arcing effect means that it takes out, because it wipes out everything here, and these nests get taken out by the arcs. So this is this point again that maybe this is a range of 30, and then it can arc out to like 60, basically. So it covers a massive area with lightning, basically. Conclusion by Arundel. Depending on the order you visit the new planets and how much you rush to the end, the Tesla turret is one of those things that you might never use and still complete Space Age. With our focus on removing things that aren't necessary, it could have been removed from the game, but it wasn't. It stuck around because it does have a clear role. It's always useful for the rest of the game if you make use of it, and especially useful if Fulgora is your first planet. Mainly though, it's still here because it's just so damn cool. As always, zap your thoughts to the usual places. So I often do a lot of these speculations and give the overall thoughts, and it's always just me saying it's so damn cool. But yeah, this is just awesome, isn't it? A Tesla turret that does chained lightning attacks and all that sort of stuff. Just absolutely amazing. Looking at this, so 60 electric damage isn't all that high, and as you can see, it's having to hit them for quite long periods of time to take, because there's big biters in here, basically. Now, obviously, the smaller ones, the medium ones, it's taking them out straight away. The nests are taking multiple hits to kill. You know, something like lasers and stuff would probably kill them quicker, although we don't know how much damage buffs this has got going on. So yeah, the point really is that you've got four of these four of these Tesla turrets, and they're wiping things out all the way back here. You know, because of the chaining effect. They're only shooting stuff here, but it chains out all the way back to some of these, and by the end, I say, it does wipe everything out. And speaking of which, one of the things it mentions in the actual in the text is about enemies having different resistances. Now, as it happens, I'm halfway through editing my weapons video, basically. So there is a section on that, as I mentioned, of me talking about a Tesla turret. So I'm just going to leave it in, I think, and I'll just put a note in saying that it has been revealed. But the point, as I say, basically, is that as part of that, I've been looking at more of the stuff like resistances and damage effects and all that sort of stuff. And none of the enemies at the moment, none of the current biters have like laser resistance or electric resistance. Okay, so they're either adding to biters an electric resistance, they're modifying the current biters, or there are going to be some enemies, and it might be that they're not biters, but some enemies somewhere have some electric resistance, and that must be being introduced into the game, because as I say, it's not currently a thing. Now you could speculate on what that is and where it is. It might be that whatever the enemy is on Fulgora, we know there's no organic enemies on Fulgora. We don't know that there's no enemies at all. They could be resistant to lightning. That makes sense. They're on a lightning planet and what have you. And it could be that actually, it's just the Fulgora ones that are resistant. Or it could be, and I will be speculating about this in a follow-up video that I'm planning about the biters and enemies, that it's perhaps a rock, paper, scissors type thing we're going to get going on, that some biters on some planets are more resistant to some of the effects and damage types that you can deal, and that there's going to be a lot of advantage in using, say, electric turrets on Nauvis, on using Tesla turrets on Nauvis, because the biters have no resistance to electric damage, but perhaps maybe on Volcanus, the lava-based biters are, whatever those are, maybe they're quite resistant because they're hardened carapace. They're made of, they've got metal in their shell sort of thing because they're coming from lava, so they're more resistant to electric damage, and so they're going to introduce more damage resistances, etc. Because we have this problem at the moment, and this is like a spoiler on that video, we have this sort of problem at the moment that basically one solution, flamer turrets plus a bit of a laser or gun turret for short range, is just like the ultimate solution for everything, and just slap them down and it's fine. I don't tend to use them because I find the logistics annoying getting the oil around, but that is like your ultimate solution because it gets multiple buffs from different infinite researches. So yeah, we have this sort of problem that there's just like one size fits all solution, and I suspect they're probably going to push us away from doing that, partly through logistics. If you're saying that flamer turrets are the most effective, well, somewhere like Volcanus doesn't have oil. It has coal, so you can make oil products, but is that going to be your best use of that source of oil? Or, I mean, Fulgora is obviously lousy with oil, but I don't know that Gleba necessarily has oil on it. So can you use flamer turrets on Gleba? And certainly, the personal flamer uses raw crude oil. So on Volcanus, that becomes useless because you're just going to use up your supply and then you can't replenish it. So I think they're going to be pushing us through various means to using different turrets on multiple places. But what's particularly interesting on that front is that it says that the laser turret must be made on Fulgora. Okay, so it is a locked recipe. It's one of these ones like the super fast belt and the foundry and stuff that can only be made on that origin planet. Okay, that suggests to me that it uses the holmium products. Now that makes sense, because if we're making super capacitors, super conductors on Fulgora, then using those in your Tesla turrets makes sense. That just feels like it's logical, and so having that be a turret that you can only make on Fulgora makes a lot of sense. It does then beg this question: we're going to be moving a lot of buildings around, which was not something I was expecting. I was expecting to move a lot of intermediates around. I was not expecting to be moving foundries and EMPs and Tesla turrets, moving them around. That adds an interesting additional layer to the logistics. If you're moving chemical plants around rather than chemicals, it's a different feel to it to me. And yeah, that does seem to push us a bit more towards this combined arms approach, rather than, as I've said, you just end up with the same solution of, well, stick flamer turrets down and you're done. Having it more that, and I particularly hope we get this with lots of different biters having different resistances, that you've got to have a flamer and a gun turret and a laser turret just as your base solution, because they'll be resistant. Different enemies will be resistant to different things, and that sticking in missile turrets and Tesla turrets just makes it all more complicated and a bit more combined arms type approach. The other thing that's mentioned, just to go back to that image, because I think you've seen that video enough now. So where we're using the handheld version, it does specifically mention an ammunition. Now that makes sense. All of the guns require an ammunition, so having one seems to be almost mandatory. But what would that ammunition be made of? What's it consist of? Because it's not going to be, I wouldn't have thought, electricity. You're not going to charge it from your equipment grid, I would guess. So instead, it's perhaps going to be canisters of something. Now, is that holmium based? Is that ammunition something you can only make on Fulgora as well? It doesn't specifically say that, but I think probably the other restriction on this is that if you're using the handheld version, you've also got to use your ammunition that is built only on Fulgora. I think that won't be a craft anywhere ammunition. You've got to have a supply of it coming from Fulgora. And as I say, I think that's going to be a more common theme, because if we're all right that uranium ammo, for example, is only based on... I'm basically telling you the entire contents of this video that I've been working really hard on. But if uranium ammo can only be made on Nauvis, or maybe it's not that it can only be made there, but the uranium to make it can only be sourced from Nauvis, so you give yourself very complex logistical chains, then if that's your best ammo, that is your only ammo that's effective against behemoth type biters, if you're then having to ship that around your entire system, is that worth doing? Or would you be better off sending a laser turret there, making sure it... Not a laser turret, a Tesla turret there, or maybe a laser turret. Would you be better off using those and having a different solution on that planet? That, to me, is the interesting question, because this thing almost feels like it could be a bit OP, this Tesla handgun. Because he wipes out his entire thing. Only fires about, is it 6 times? Let's see if we can count them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 shots and it's taken out that entire group of mostly big biters and spitters. You know, I don't think anything would be able to kill them at that sort of... In fact, there's small ones and stuff as well. Yeah, killing this with the current weapons we got would be quite tricky, actually. You know, you would struggle to do that. The Flamer would eventually take them out, but the Flamer has that, you know, disadvantage of you can't fire it at your feet and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, this feels like it's a very powerful weapon. So it makes sense to put a cap on it of how much you can use it by how much ammunition you can transport around from Fulgora. Just to end off then, there is a very odd sort of statement, and it could just be a weird phrasing, that it's stuck around because it does have a clear role. It's always useful for the rest of the game if you make use of it. Those are understandable, and this is and especially useful if Fulgora is your first planet. That's a very odd phrasing, isn't it? I mean, why would it be especially useful if Fulgora is your first planet? That implies that there's a very special reason that this would be a particularly good turret. It could be that, you know, as I've been speculating, that there is this sort of inorganic enemy, maybe a turret or alien turret or something like that on Fulgora, and that limits you from getting at the richest patches. If you go in there as your first planet, my assumption would be that means you are the least teched of any planet that you reach. Yeah, so when you go to your second planet, at the very least, you will have the things you do on your first planet when you go there. When you get to your third planet, you will have the things that you did on your first two. In other words, if you've gone to Volcanus first, you've got the foundry. You can turn up with, even if it's just half a dozen or something, you can turn up with a bunch of foundries and get rocking with producing stuff. Okay, that to me then implies that they effectively act as like a booster for the subsequent planets you get to. So this seems to be saying that having a Tesla turret is a really nice boost that you can get from Fulgora. So that, to me, suggests either, as I say, that combating this, if it's there, turret that's on Fulgora, enemy turret, alien turret, then the Lightning Tesla cannon, as it were, is the best way to deal with that. And the other weapons, like the missile turret, are not very good at doing it. So it's especially useful, you know, when you get it from Fulgora. But also, perhaps, the resistances that they're introducing for other biters and other planets are much less for electric type damage than they are for other damages. So, for example, it might be that on Volcanus, the biters there are super resistant because they're maybe, as I mentioned, hard and they've got metal, you know, carapaces, they're on a hot planet, so perhaps they're basically immune to fire. You know, they do take damage from lasers, and that's why we've seen lasers on that planet. We haven't seen any guns there. Possibly that's because the only ammo that works with them is uranium ammo. You know, that they're all basically as protected as a behemoth biter, maybe even the small ones. So using anything but uranium ammo is bad, and you can't get uranium ammo easily because you've got to transport it via platform. So having this Tesla turret, which only requires electricity, is great because maybe they're not, you know, maybe they've got only a tiny resistance to electric damage, and so you can just blast them with this turret, which you wouldn't have unless you'd gone to Fulgora first. That's what I'm interpreting that to mean, that basically getting the electric damage dealing Tesla turret is a really good thing to have when you go to all your other planets. You know, it gives you that little extra boost for combat that you don't get from the other planets, maybe. But yeah, I just thought that was a very interesting way of phrasing it, that it was especially useful if Fulgora is your first planet. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you'd like to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over on my Twitch channel, Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. A forking good time.